My name's Laurie Woodrow. I work as a volunteer here at D.D. Hirsch Mental Health Services with the Survivors After Suicide program. I came here 15 years after my father's suicide and joined a group they have for survivors after suicide. After that, I became a volunteer and went through training and became a co-facilitator of groups that are for people who have recently lost someone to suicide. When I co-facilitate groups, we provide these groups, again, as I mentioned, for recent survivors after a suicide loss. They sign up for an 8-week group. That group will be the same people for 8 weeks, meeting once a week for an hour and a half. And I'm a co-facilitator, which means I'm not a mental health professional, but we have a lead facilitator who is. And that's just a place where people can come and talk about their loss and process their grief, and most importantly, be in a room where they are with people who have gone through something similar. And in many cases, it's the only place where you're sitting in a room with people who really get what you've gone through and understand what you're feeling and experiencing. So it can be an extremely cathartic experience, especially for people who are very new to their loss. In these support groups, we do hear very often that the person who died felt that their loved ones would be better off, they were doing them a favor, and it's just so not true. In every single instance, the person is there just grieving over the fact that they would give anything, for that not to have happened. In the groups, we do hear that very often, that the person who died by suicide felt that their family members would be better off without them. I have never heard anyone in a group say that that was the case. It seems that the person who is suicidal just has a certain tunnel vision where their truth is very different than the reality that's going on around them. The losses are devastating, and the survivors, if they could go back and talk to the person they lost, they would explain to them and express how much that's not true and how much they wish they were still there, given all the problems, all the issues they were dealing with, all the pain they're going through. No one feels that they're better off. When people first are dealing with this loss, it's a terrible grief. But with suicide, there are certain added layers. There may be feelings of guilt, feelings of blame, feelings of shame. And it's very different from grief over an expected death or a death by a different type of illness. When it's a suicide death, it becomes a very isolating thing for the survivors. They find that in social situations, they're afraid to talk about it. People are afraid to talk to them. There is still a little bit of a stigma on discussing a suicide. And that's why we find in the survivor groups that it's sometimes the one place where people can just let all their feelings out, talk about all of these mixed emotions they're feeling. We do hear people talking about being isolated at work. People don't know what to say to them, if they should mention the suicide, if they shouldn't. And there are just very few situations where they feel comfortable talking about it. In many instances, people do feel guilt over the loss of their loved one, and it's a very long process to accept that the person made a choice. My father took his life in November of 1983. He was 49 years old. I was 23 years old at the time, and he had been struggling for a number of years. He was diagnosed bipolar. At the time, they were calling it manic depressive. He was a doctor himself, and the old saying that doctors make the worst patients. It was very, very difficult for him to come to terms with his issues. On the one hand, professionally, he felt like it would just be the end of his career if any of his colleagues knew what he was going through, so he had to hide it. He, being a doctor, felt that he could treat himself, which did not go very well. The treatments available at the time were very different than they were now. A lot of the medications that we have now weren't available then. And he was on and off various medications. He went through electroshock therapy. He was under a psychiatrist's care. But ultimately, he took his life. He had one attempt, which was an overdose, alcohol and pills, and he survived that. And less than a week later, he jumped from a bridge. In the months leading up to his death, his behavior became more and more erratic, and as a family, we saw what was going on, but I don't think we really had the tools to know how to cope with it. We tried as best we could to express to him that we supported him, that whatever choices he wanted to make regarding his career or life changes, we were behind him. But by then he had such tunnel vision, all he could see was failure, and that his life was over, he had nothing to live for. Every little problem that he thought he had was exponentially increased in his mind. So he stopped thinking rationally, and so we as a family were kind of at a loss as to how we could help him. We supported him in getting help from other professionals. We reinforced our love and support of him, but it was almost falling on deaf ears in the last weeks. I do recall a time when my sister confronted him in the middle of the night. He was trying to leave the house, and she was yelling at him and saying, "Don't do it. Do you realize what you'll do to us?" You know, things that I was afraid to say, but she just let it rip. And still, you know, it may have stopped something at that precise moment, but I don't think it altered the course of his thinking. When he overdosed, I was the one who found him, and I called a neighbor who was also a doctor, who came over and said, "We have to get him to the hospital right away," but then said, "Let's just carry him into the car, because if we call an ambulance, the neighbors will start nosing around and we don't want them to know what's going on." So that was the depth of the stigma of this thing at that period of time. So, you know, at that point I knew that this was very, very serious. After he came out of a coma in the hospital after 3 days, I think he realized at that point that actions were going to be taken that he would have no control over, and that was, I think, the tipping point. And from that point on, it seemed that he was just bound and determined to take his life. A couple of days later, when my mom called me over to the house and told me that he had died, I felt like my life ended. It was the most devastating news I'd ever received. I was in shock. I was numb. I couldn't even cry. I was just beyond belief, beyond words. It took me a long time to get my life going again. I quit my job the very next day, went into a depression myself. Members of my family were reacting in very different ways, and so, you know, the family was shattered. It was truly devastating. At the time of my father's suicide, there were really no services available. It was pre-internet. There was really nothing that I could find that dealt specifically with suicide. And so I did nothing for a long time, and you know, just dealt with it in a very internal, isolating way. It wasn't until 15 years later that I found out that there were groups for survivors after suicide. Just found out about it coincidentally from a friend who had made a film with a suicide theme, and I asked him if he had done any research into it, and he mentioned an organization that had provided some information, and that's how I found out about Didi Hirsch and the survivors after suicide groups that they offered. And I wasn't sure if it was right for me because it was 15 years later, and these were new losses that seemed that they were catering the groups to. But they said, no, there's no statute of limitations, come in. And I went to my first group thinking I'll just sit quietly and listen to what's going on. I didn't feel like a group situation was right for me. But I did go, and after a couple of weeks, I found myself just spilling things and emotions that I basically stuffed for 15 years, and doing it in such a safe and compassionate space that every single person in the room knew what I was going through and understood, and vice versa. And the fact that I had been 15 years down the line in my loss and had managed to rebuild my life, I felt was something that the other people in the group who were maybe only weeks or months out from their loss could relate to. And, and after that, I went through training to become a co-facilitator, and that's what led me to doing the volunteer work that I do now. If I could say something to someone who is feeling suicidal and like they have no options, I would say, I know you're in pain. I know you feel like you have no options, but please hold on. Explore your options. There is help. There are people who will listen to you. Just hang on.